Hello there and welcome to Digital Foundry Direct Weekly number 194. It is the last show of 2024, so we're all breathing a big sigh of relief here before we go on vacation. Lots to talk about though. The gaming news is just not letting up. It's continuing, and joining me to discuss it, first of all, Oliver Mackenzie. Hello.
Yes, Rich, it's been a long year, closed out by some pretty exciting content, but I'm looking forward to the year ahead and certainly the rest of the show.
Absolutely. And of course, John Linneman. Hello.
Hello, good to be here, guys. And I've got my gray 30th anniversary edition DualSense here, thanks to MG Subby on the Discord, who sold it to me at cost.
Wow.
So I was trying to get one of those, and they've been sold out around here. So just wanted to say thanks to him.
Happy days.
I like it. It's cool. It's a good color combination.
Okay.
Looks better than the normal one. So
you'd hope so.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, it is the last show of the year. Plenty to get through, though, so let's get straight to it. Okay, so what can you say? Switch 2 is inevitably going to be coming in the year of our Lord, 2025. And, well, what can I say? There's been a huge bunch of leaks, various crazy things happening. For example, Dbrand have basically already made a case for it and are claiming to have
Has Linus covered it yet?
Who knows? But they're basically claiming to have laser scanned a Switch 2 production unit. And then we have the curious case of a guy posting on Reddit by a guy with a hacker alias of Next Handheld, who is basically saying he's got the Switch 2. And I seem to recall that he wasn't going to provide any proof that he's got the Switch 2 until December the 25th, 2024, which is an interesting strategy. But, however, his claims have been given credence by Sean Hollister from The Verge, who has spoken to him, and he seems to think it's legit. Well, what can I say? Oliver, you've been looking at this.
Yes.
This is kind of wacky and not really the way a console should kind of be revealed, but here we are.
Yeah, I mean, I guess leaks are par for the course, of course, with these kinds of things. Obviously, we saw it with the PlayStation 5 Pro. We knew just about every critical element of the PS5 Pro in, I think, April of this year. Maybe it was March of this year. We knew it pretty early on. And certainly here with the Switch 2, we're learning quite a bit about it ahead of its release date. Most importantly, perhaps, that it is indeed called the Switch 2, apparently, which Nintendo's gotten into trouble with their naming schemes before. I don't think they've ever named a console with a 2 at the end. Like if you think, N64, Super NES, Wii U, GBA, Game Boy Color, right? 3DS.
Closest thing I would say, Oliver, is the Super Game Boy 2.
Or the 2DS. But that doesn't really count, right? that doesn't really count. Yeah. And then, like, you look back, and there's always some confusion about it. I think probably the low sales of the Wii U, in part, like, were probably due to some level of brand confusion with the Wii, and what does the Wii U mean in relation to the Wii, right? So I think they're going to benefit potentially from some clarity in terms of their position there, and benefit from the huge Switch brand, right? There are some details in here that I think are interesting, though, out of this report, like the stuff about the magnets. I'm very curious to see how strong that actual magnet mechanism is to being like tilted up and down and back and forth, because that was not perfect on the original Switch unit. It could flex a little bit. Now, obviously, that's been rumored for a little while. It's pretty much nailed on now. But I'm kind of surprised that like little back rotated trigger thing they have going on there is apparently just to physically detach the magnets so that you get that disconnect from the unit there. Because that seems to me like something that is a pretty odd and obvious and large physical impediment there that you're just using to get the magnets in there, which seems like a whole lot of engineering effort, but I suppose if they can bring up reliability, that could be a good move there. The other thing I thought was interesting is they're talking about potentially a revised cooling assembly in the dock, because it apparently has some feet that could allow for airflow from some kind of fan. But I'm really curious to see what that means, because plastic is a pretty good insulator. And if you have a plastic console and you just blow cold air over it, it's not going to have a huge effect on internal temperatures, right? I on the one hand, you could think, well, if the unit is getting really hot and you have a fan blowing air over it, maybe that's just to keep the device comfortable to hold when you take it out of the dock. But if it was to actually have some role in cooling the internal components of the Switch 2, on like an SoC level, then maybe it would make more sense if like the back of the device had some kind of aluminum component to it, right? Where maybe the heatsink could be hooked up there, and maybe you could actually get some cooling effect from being able to blow cold air over the back of the device because you have a thermally conductive material there. I actually had, this is a bit of a tangent, but I had some pre-Apple Silicon MacBook Pros that always used to throttle, and the solution that I had to deal with those when I was doing various rendering and exporting workloads at prior jobs is I built this little stand with perforated holes in the bottom, and I'd put this huge fan underneath it, and by blowing air onto the bottom of this laptop, I actually got it to stop throttling because it was getting so warm, that chassis was getting so warm, it was actually like wicking heat away from the processor. By blowing cold air onto it, I actually managed to prevent that behavior from occurring. So I don't think this is that. Wow. Maybe it's just for comfort, or maybe this is just an aspect of the report that is not going to prove to be 100% correct there. But I think it's interesting. The idea of a fan in the dock is certainly something I wasn't really considering as a possibility. But they are talking as well about higher amounts of power that are going into that dock, up to 60 watts. They're talking about, which is quite a lot of wattage there.
I'm not sure about that. I'm not quite sure what sort of performance gain you'd get from putting 60 watts through a mobile processor with inherent bandwidth limitations. I don't know whether it's maybe people are looking at the actual wattage of the power brick as opposed to measuring wattage from the wall. Obviously, the switch power supply that you got with it was like massively overspec'd for the actual performance of the unit. Also, you've got to bear in mind that the dock would need to be charging and playing at the same time. So it's got to be charging the battery as well. So if it is based on what they're looking at from the power brick, I'm not really quite sure how much we can draw from that. This concept of enhanced cooling versus the original certainly has some credence to it. Obviously, with the new unit, it's significantly larger, much larger surface area. The thing that stands out to me is that they're saying that the actual depth of the unit is quite similar to the original Switch as well. And if you've got that kind of cooling challenge, that's quite an interesting point as well. It's not going to be a big and bulky unit like some of the PC handhelds we've seen. It's just going to be a much larger area, so to speak. I don't really know what to make about this. I mean, Sean Hollister on The Verge, he knows what he's talking about. He claims to have seen proof that sort of corroborates the claims being made by Next Handheld here. What can I say though? I just find the whole thing a bit weird. You've got access to a Switch 2, or rather, a Redditor claims to have seen and touched an actual final retail unit. We must presume that they are out and about, bearing in mind that Dbrand claims to have laser scanned it. So there's something going on here. But the concept of being so ready to talk to people on Reddit, but not serving up actual proof, or even turning the unit on. Maybe it just wasn't able to be turned on. Who knows? There's something a bit odd going on here, though. John, what do you make of all of this?
Yeah, so one of the things that really, I guess, the big takeaway here centers on the Joy-Con themselves and the changes they made. Oliver obviously touched on the magnetic rail system, and in some of the photos being shared around, you can kind of see how it would connect into the unit, which is quite different from the current mechanism where it actually has like a depth to it. So where it seems like it clicks in all the way. And I think that actually might be the key to some additional stability, because like Oliver suggested, there is this sort of like a flimsiness to the current Switch where it feels okay enough, but like it doesn't have that solid feeling you'd expect from a single body unit. And I'm hoping that the magnets here, in addition to this sort of like extra groove in the controller itself, helps make it feel a little bit more solid. I also noticed that every image that we've seen of these new Joy-Con seems to suggest that there's a protrusion on the backside to give it sort of more of a grip in your hand, akin to, I guess, technically like the Steam Deck or something. It's always with a case on though, so it's difficult to say if that's actually part of the design, but because it's showing up in all these different case shots, it makes me think that they've expanded that, which in addition to comfort, that would also suggest that they could include a larger battery inside these. And there's also talk about using magnetic Hall effects joysticks instead, because famously Nintendo never addressed the stick drift issue. It has remained a problem for the Switch even today. I've had issues with the Switch OLED even, which is not that old, I suppose, and have had to replace one of the joysticks in there. Which, by the way, is something you don't necessarily think about, but I swapped the internals on one of my Joy-Con to keep the white aesthetic, because I liked the white plastic on it.
Right.
But the one I swapped it from was a blue Joy-Con. And I didn't think anything of it until I had booted up the system and realized that the system detects it as a blue Joy-Con. There's a little graphic to show that it's blue, right? So each Joy-Con is color coded to the system as well. So it always shows up as blue. But I hope that the new joystick change solves this issue, and I would imagine it would, because Nintendo is clearly aware of this problem for a very long time, and they've not been able to solve it on the current Switch. So that would be a huge deal, I think, in terms of improving the user experience. I guess the main thing we don't know about the shape, though, is I mentioned the protrusions, is there is the earlier CAD drawings. The only protrusion there was the triggers around themselves. And you can actually see that the ZL and RL triggers are larger. And that also houses the little mechanism for releasing the magnets. But all the cases being shared around show larger protrusions as well for the grips. But I suppose that could just be, again, the cases themselves. So there's still a lot we don't know. The problem, though, with the CAD drawing is that the CAD drawing also only shows a kickstand similar to the Switch OLED. And there's talk in this Verge article about it becoming sort of like a U-shaped kickstand, but that could also be part of the case. So there's still a lot of mystery here. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, just going back to the Verge article, talking about the power situation. The dock rated for 60 watts. Again, the dock would need to be charging the Switch at the same time as actually playing. So, that's going to be significantly higher, as I already said. But the interesting thing here, which has been picked up by some people, the Switch 2 itself is rated for 45 watts. The concept of a Switch 2 drawing 45 watts, that puts it up there with a ROG Ally, but it's kind of not a particularly plausible scenario for a handheld device. Let's say we've been really generous here. Let's say it's got a Steam Deck style, 50 watt hour battery. Basically, that means you get slightly more than an hour of battery life. I don't think Nintendo would ever put out a device that only had that amount of playtime. It's going to be significantly lower. So yeah, I don't really know what to say about that. Other than maybe
it could just be the hardware specification, I guess. It's technically
it could just be the way that typically power supplies that are given with consoles are typically way over specced compared to actual power draw. The Switch 2 has got to. I mean, we also had that leak of a prototype internal of the Switch 2, and the battery looks very, very small on that. Certainly not 50 watt hours. So I'm quite sort of intrigued to see what all of this is about. Yeah. I think ultimately Nintendo is always going to be prioritizing battery life over performance. Yeah, and it's just down to the developers to kind of work with the constraints that they're given. Which, to be fair, they did in spectacular style on the first Switch. Oliver, anything more on this before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I could definitely see Nintendo going with a bit more of an aggressive concept for that docked behavior there, because they do have apparently a copper heatsink, 2 fans. If you look at the fan grill there, at least on the sample units that are being passed around in CAD drawings and 3D printed mock-ups, it looks about twice the size of that original Switch unit's fan grill there. So it does suggest a unit that maybe could consume a lot more wattage, but again, in portable mode, would you really want that? Because you probably don't have a much larger battery there. Probably not. But in docked play, you could probably push that up pretty far, I'd imagine, if that's what they want to do to address 4K displays in a more convincing manner. That's personally what I would suspect might be going on there. But certainly the idea of a Switch 2 that's pulling like ROG Ally levels of power through the SoC seems implausible to me. I mean, the ROG Ally has a really meaty cooling assembly, even relative to what we've seen out of the Switch 2 various leaks there. So I would suspect that it would consume a lot less power than a ROG Ally in turbo mode, for instance. That's a lot of power.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I quite like the idea of actually Nintendo pushing the boat out in terms of power for the docked setup, because that's basically been the major problem from my perspective with the original Switch, is that the gulf in terms of performance and in terms of pixel counts, etc., between docked and handheld play just isn't wide enough, and that basically means that the living room TV experience just isn't really good enough, and I suspect that might be what's going on here. But who knows? I mean, I think what's quite interesting about this is that all of the leaks we've seen thus far haven't actually been anything to do with developer documentation. In terms of the hardware makeup of the Switch, we don't know the Switch 2 rather. We don't really know anything about the tools that developers have got to work with. We don't know anything about the disclosures that Nintendo has made to developers. I find that really interesting, because you would imagine that all of the developers that leaked all of the PlayStation 5 Pro details, those studios are also going to be working on Switch 2. So why that sort of stuff hasn't leaked. What I can say from back in the day with the first Switch, because obviously we actually broke the story of what the clock speeds actually were for the original Switch. All I can really say is that it was extremely difficult to get that information. And yet, at the same time, obviously, there's a wealth of developers out there that are working on Switch 2 as we speak. In terms of what we can say, all I can really say is that, well, expect a lot of PlayStation 4 era games being ported to Switch 2. It's just a kind of natural fit, I think. And you've got obviously DLSS to mitigate the resolution differences there. Any more? Shall we move on? I
was just thinking, unrelated to the Switch, but kind of related. You were talking about clock speeds and power draw and all that. I've been experimenting a lot with the Quest game optimizer on the Quest 3, and that allows you to push the CPU, GPU, and everything up as far as it goes. And it's been interesting seeing how much of performance boost you get from that, but also how much it drains the battery. So I'm curious to know when the Nintendo Switch 2 is eventually cracked, and it will be, what kind of clock speeds we'll be able to get out of this thing and what it'll do to battery life.
Yeah.
Because the Quest even has warnings that pop up and says, oh, you're using a tremendous amount of battery. You should probably enable power save settings.
I mean, the thing about the Switch hacking is obviously from Nintendo's perspective, it's not great. But from a Digital Foundry perspective, I mean, last week, they've actually now got arbitrary display frequency working on Switch. You can run it at 50 hertz on a TV.
No way.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
There's crazy stuff going on there. It's really fascinating to see
this
that
community,
actually happen.
these guys, incredible.
Okay, I think that's all we've got to say about Switch 2 for now. So I guess we're going to move on. Okay, so this week Alan Wake 2 was patched by Remedy for PlayStation 5 Pro users. This one was quite interesting when we first took a look at the Pro patch, because it wasn't a sort of across-the-board upgrade that we would have hoped for. Performance in performance mode was on par or lower than the base PlayStation 5 version. There were image quality concerns with PSSR. Lots going on there, and I'd say that our sort of response was sort of lukewarm, but Remedy has responded. They have put out a comprehensive patch for Alan Wake 2 on PlayStation 5 Pro. Timing-wise, we just don't have time to do a full video, but Oliver, you've got the Cliff Notes. You took a look at it.
Yes, I did. I took a look at it. If you look at Remedy's blog post announcing this update, they basically say there are 4 key changes here. They've adjusted the visual settings of the performance mode to achieve a more consistent frame rate. They've adjusted the ray tracing settings in that quality mode to achieve a less noisy image. They've added a PSSR and FSR toggle, and they've added a new balanced graphics mode for 40 FPS gameplay. So going through those options, first there are the alleged changes to performance mode, and I say alleged because I performed a few side-by-side comparisons in scenes that I thought would reveal pretty obvious visual settings differences in foliage, in shadow quality and coverage, in draw distance, basically all the settings that were upgraded from the base PS5 performance mode to the PS5 Pro performance mode. I thought they might be pulling some of those back, but it turns out that they're pretty similar between the 2 patches on PS5 Pro there. So that left me a little bit confused. Image quality also looks pretty similar between the 2 patches. Mostly it seems about the same there. Possibly there are some minor settings reductions here that I'm just not seeing, and perhaps some more thorough investigation would produce some more differences, but I imagine there are some tweaks there. Pixel counts reveal the same roughly 864p resolution internally, so there's no change to input resolution, it seems like. But performance-wise, there is some improvement. In the demanding lakeside area, I lined up a couple shots, and the game is operating at about 10% higher now, even with PSSR. Okay. And if we move over to FSR, it's getting a little bit more additional performance still. So it does seem to be an effective upgrade there in terms of getting the game to a more stable frame rate on PS5 Pro. And that's like the most demanding area in this game for the most part. You're going to be getting a stable 60 FPS, I think, in most content. They also say they've adjusted the ray tracing settings to achieve a less noisy image in the quality mode and also the balanced mode. We'll touch on that in a moment. And that's true. Across a range of content, the RT reflections do appear less noisy. So it's possible they've changed something with their denoising, because in scenes that have reflective detail, I'm seeing a little bit less noise, and the noise that is there has a smaller grain to it. So it's not quite as obtrusive. But it also looks like on some semi-gloss surfaces there isn't obvious RT. So possibly the detail just isn't displaying because of some denoising, possibly. Or I think more likely they may have adjusted the roughness cutoff a little bit to give the image more stable appearance, because RT reflections are just no longer showing up on those surfaces, essentially. So right. I think it does look better on the whole. Probably a couple tweaks there to just improve the general quality of the RT presentation on PS5 Pro, because I don't think, especially some of those semi-gloss reflections before, were actually doing the game any favors, because they did appear so unstable and they were so visually conspicuous. Yeah. I think this is maybe a better choice, if that is indeed what they have made there. Then there's the PSSR toggle, which is becoming a bit of a trend on PS5 Pro, unfortunately. I looked at the performance mode here, and the key difference to me seems to be that with FSR, you get a more perceptibly 4K-like image there without any kind of excessive noise. So both modes are going from 864p to 4K, but PSSR has a harder time of kind of converging that really stable, good-looking, sharp image in still shots, in relatively still shots. With Pro, it looks a touch better during movement, I would say. A little bit less of that artifacting, especially in areas that have recently been disoccluded. We see that often with FSR, that it has that issue, that kind of noisy salt and pepper pattern of disocclusion fizzle, as Alex calls it. So maybe PSSR is a little bit better during movement, but in stills I would prefer FSR, so perhaps that's the better choice overall there. But I do kind of wonder about their approach in the performance mode, because 864p to 4K, it's a pretty heavy upscale there, pretty heavy upscaling factor. Maybe like 1080p internally to 1440p might produce a bit of a better result, a more consistent result. Again, just speculating there, but based on what other games achieve, I think that would probably be pretty plausible. With quality mode, it's kind of the same deal, where I prefer PSSR in motion, but FSR in stills. But there, because we're dealing with higher resolutions, the differences aren't quite as obvious. So either one, I'm not sure which one I would pick there. But Alan Wake, it wasn't that bad with PSSR relative to some other titles like Silent Hill 2, like Jedi Survivor, like Avatar pre-patch. Those are all titles that had greater issues than Alan Wake 2. So it's not like Alan Wake 2 really needed this change. It's just nice to have that option, obviously. Then finally, there's one last major change here, which is there's a 40 FPS balanced mode. As far as I can tell, it's basically as Remedy puts it, which is that it combines the ray tracing of the quality mode with the image quality settings of the performance mode. So it's 864p internally there in that balanced mode. In side-by-sides, the ray tracing seems pretty similar between the balanced mode and the quality mode, perhaps ever so slightly noisier and blurrier in that balanced mode. Unfortunately, I can only capture this mode at 1440p because of hardware limitations at 120 Hz, but it looks a lot like the performance mode to my eyes. It looks very similar to my eyes, just with that RT added in. And the performance in that mode is basically a flat 40 FPS in my readings, even going through some of the more demanding sequences in Chapter 2. Finally, there's one last change I wanted to mention, which is they fixed that bug that I mentioned, where the SSAO wouldn't display correctly. When you switched from the quality mode to the performance mode, it would basically turn the SSAO off often. That issue is gone, but I looked through their patch notes and it seems to have been fixed in an update from late November. So not this patch, but it seems to have been fixed a little bit earlier. So overall, I think there are some solid changes here. The performance mode runs a lot better. The balanced mode is interesting and gives you RT at a more playable frame rate, in my opinion. The changes to RT make for a more stable image, And the new toggle is nice to have. I mean, it's nice to have options, and I think for sure in that performance mode, you probably want to go with FSR just because it's giving you a much more 4K-like image in stills and a much more stable image with that PSSR noise in stills. But, you know, overall, this was not like a desperately needed patch, I'd have to say. But it's nice to have these options, and yeah, there is a certain tendency here where we're getting those PSSR and FSR toggles, and that maybe is a good short-term interim solution to provide players with some choice. When PSSR is not doing everything that we'd like it to do in these titles, which is to be a truly comprehensive upgrade over FSR, perhaps that's a reasonable compromise point to make at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's the thing, right? Because when some of these patches were coming out with issues, there was kind of like a call to be able to disable pro enhancements and just run the base code, you know, a sort of system level toggle, which I think would have been an overreaction.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, this is kind of like the best way forward, you know, to mitigate issues with PSSR while they're still there. Clearly, it's a work in progress, so I suspect, you know, they'll get there eventually. But yeah, just to give the choice to the user, that does seem like a pretty pro-like thing to do. I guess we still don't really have a comprehensive answer to the image quality issues, though, that Alan Wake 2 pretty much always had, right? It's, you know, you've got to choose between two compromised solutions, really, right?
Yeah, I think a combination of a higher internal resolution with maybe a more conservative output resolution, I think that might work, especially for FSR. Certainly, that's the tendency that we do tend to observe with FSR, where really extreme upscale factors, even when you're going to a high resolution from a not crazily low internal resolution, that's not a great way to go about it with that technique. You tend to get a lot more of that disocclusion fizzle, a lot more of that noise, a lot more of that aliasing, that nastiness. You tend to want to go from something like 1080p to 1440p. So in general, that's a better route to go. With PSSR, I'm not quite as sure there, because it just seems like with PSSR, sometimes you get results that are a little bit on the soft side. I'm not totally sure what PSSR would look like going to 1440p. I'm not actually aware of any titles necessarily that have used PSSR to 1440p that we've been able to confirm. I think in some cases, the result is that it's going to 4K, but it just looks a little bit like 1440p because it's so soft and lacking in detail in some cases. So, yeah, I'm not sure how that would look with PSSR. With FSR, certainly I think that would be a preferable choice, at least judging from the results in this title on PC, for instance. I think that's probably a better route to go. Maybe that's what they should consider possibly for the future.
What would be your recommendation for the modes then, since there's a wealth to choose from at this point?
I'm usually quite partial to performance modes, and I kind of like the performance mode now with FSR on PS5 Pro. But I think the balance mode is also pretty reasonable. You get the RT reflections. You can turn on FSR in that mode. There's also a PSSR and FSR toggle in that mode. And if you're fine with a little bit of a reduction in fluidity, a little bit of an increase in input lag, that could be a good mode to go down. It just really depends on personal preference. Like, none of the modes here are bad options necessarily. It's going to depend on what you want. Adding the RT reflections in there is nice. It doesn't really hold a candle to like the PC maxed out with full-on ray tracing, you know. But it does look a substantial bit better than the game without the RT reflections for sure.
Okay, good stuff. So let's move on. Interesting thing happened this week with Bethesda and Machine Games. They've released a patch for Indiana Jones, and it seems to have addressed one of the visual issues that we picked up on, which is that the RTGI seemed to be quite sparse within the Xbox version of the game. And it looks like they've produced some kind of adjustment for that. Got this question from Edna Mode. When I first saw John's tech review, I had the feeling that RTGI left something to be desired. After I saw Alex's videos in comparison with PC's lower settings, I felt the Series X should have included an option for a reduced resolution / frame rate mode. Does this patch fix it enough to bring the RTGI quality up to a level where 1800p would be the best way you guys would play it, or perhaps a 40 FPS mode or a 1080p 60 mode is still to be desired? Well, John, there's two aspects to this. First of all, well, let's talk about what the visual enhancements to Indiana Jones are, and then secondly, let's talk about those various mode options that Edna Mode is suggesting there. Now, Edna Mode there is kind of suggesting that we're looking at a comprehensive upgrade to the RTGI, which is across the whole game. But based on what we've seen, that's not the case, right?
Yeah, that's not the case at all. The main improvement just comes down to areas heavy in foliage, from what I can tell. Essentially, the reason it looked off in the first place, from what I gather, is that they simply weren't including all of the detail in the BVH. So when it's tracing into it, for instance, the trees, I think they had a very simplified leafless tree model or something in there that did not reflect what the player was seeing. And as a result, you get tons of light leakage. Everything was glowing brightly. The patch basically fixes that. And that's why I think when they announced the patch, they showed shots from the introduction, which is very foliage heavy. And it's exactly as it says on the tin. It massively improves that. A lot of the glow's been reduced. The light leak is reduced, and you get a lot more deep shadow and contrast and nuance in the scene. But when you step outside of those areas, the difference, I would say, is overall negligible. And I kind of felt that way before, though, to be honest. The RTGI really shines in most of the game, except for in those areas, and they have certainly improved it now thanks to the patch. So it looks like they went back in, added more detail into the BVH, likely to give the RTGI something more to trace into. And yeah, the result is great. It looks a lot better.
Mm-hmm. Cool. But do you think that there is a case that they should have maybe included options that traded resolution for increased ray tracing, or is it just fine the way it is?
My opinion on this is that they made the right choice by limiting this to no modes. I think that's actually what makes this kind of unique in this day and age, is that they just said, here it is. And they've basically fixed the main issue that the RTGI had, which is with foliage heavy areas. And now that has been solved, image quality is still excellent. I don't really think there's any real use in further enhancing this, because it's not that far behind the PC version, I would say, in terms of what you visually perceive, unless you compare to the full ray tracing mode, of course. But we're not going to get that on the Xbox, obviously. So I think it's fine just the way it is. It's great to have a game like this that just is 60 FPS, good image quality, and ray tracing, and you don't have to make any choices or compromises, basically.
Mm-hmm. That's basically your sort of viewpoint on the entire console modes situation, isn't it, Oliver?
Yeah, I kind of like that in general, when you get this like nice, no compromise presentation, or at least a presentation that's been authored with certain compromises in mind that fit the general play style of most players on these consoles. Certainly, I think having a good, high quality 60 FPS mode with ray tracing, that's really the ideal. You're kind of checking a lot of boxes there. But yeah, I'm glad that they've gone back in and maybe compromised resolution just a touch, possibly, to get that BVH to be more comprehensive there and get that additional RTGI detail. I kind of almost always take additional lighting fidelity over, maybe some tiny margin of DRS there. And I'm glad they have gone in and resolved those lighting issues in accordance with player feedback, because that was a weird and slightly discordant divergence between the PC version and the console version, that we saw such a difference in lighting quality even between the console versions and the PC version's low settings. I thought that was kind of striking and not super flattering. So I am glad they fixed those issues, at least in the areas where it was obviously quite impactful. But yeah, I'm quite pleased with that.
And that's important to note, because the impact areas, there are some other areas later in the game, but most of the game you spend in areas that are not foliage heavy, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like largely this didn't have a huge impact, and all the screenshots you would see in comparisons would show the introduction sequence, which is like 15 minutes long. So it's not an area that was that important, because you don't spend much time there, right? Mm-hmm. But it is nice that they've improved it, and I would say with negligible hit to image quality. Mm-hmm. I have not specifically pixel counted, but just playing it on the screen, it looks basically identical to what it looked like before. So
okay. That's cool. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we've kind of reached a situation where typically you have like a 30 FPS quality mode or a 60 FPS performance mode, but 30 FPS just isn't id tech, really, is it? It wouldn't really have been a good fit for this. And I think the idea to go in there and basically tailor a single experience at 60 frames per second that is basically what the developer wanted to achieve, and then basically just leave all of the settings tailoring to the PC version. I think that's probably the way forward, really. I guess the only criticism that remains, I guess, is that those console equivalent settings are not accessible to PC, and I think Alex's critique there pretty much remains in effect, which is to say that there's quite a lot of RT hardware out there that is relatively underpowered, everything from Steam Deck upwards, basically. So it would have been nice to have those features in there.
To that end, Rich, I would like to point out that Steam Deck support now has been added, or at least it works correctly.
Right.
At launch, when we attempted it, it was like 1 to 2 FPS and then it would crash. Right now, if you cap it at 30, you turn the settings pretty far down, you know, make the typical compromise you expect on the Steam Deck, it is actually very playable. Yes, 30 FPS, but given what it's doing and given the specs in the Steam Deck, I'd say it's kind of a win. It is still playable there now.
Excellent. Good stuff. Okay, let's move on. Well, this is quite interesting. We've had some indication that the new Lenovo Go is going to support SteamOS. We've got this report from The Verge here pointing out that, Valve itself is going to be at a Lenovo event that's coming to CES 25, and Microsoft is going to be there too, which is interesting. Oliver, you've been following this whole SteamOS saga for quite some time now, the migration of SteamOS to other devices. I'm curious what you make of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hugely exciting that we're seeing devices that are natively running SteamOS potentially that are not from Valve. Here, obviously, you had the leak last week of that Steam button on the device, which seemed to pretty much nail them there. And then you have this CES announcement that certainly does seem to follow, would be following in that trend. But I think it's pretty exciting because for me, I like the Steam Deck, I like what it's doing, but it's not necessarily giving you everything that you want necessarily out of a Windows gaming handheld or out of a portable gaming handheld in terms of higher TDP modes, in terms of achieving higher performance levels, in terms of having possibly a controller configuration that feels a bit more comfortable to play for certain types of games like racing games and shooting games. In terms of having stronger vibration, the Steam Deck has pretty light vibration, I would say, relative to something like the ROG Ally. And also in terms of having a VRR display, because at least in my experience with the ROG Ally, having a VRR display for these low power handhelds really elevates the device and makes it a lot more usable in a wider range of game content. So I think there are a lot of areas where the Steam Deck potentially is not a perfect device for every single use case, even though I think it's a fantastic portable handheld for a lot of use cases. It's also obviously the case that the Steam Deck doesn't really do very much for the kind of console experience or desktop experience that people would like to have with a controller, and that's where possibly some successor to the Steam machine might come in. But I'm just really happy to see this because I don't think Windows serves Windows gaming handhelds very well. And I think once you remove Windows from Windows gaming handhelds, you end up with a lot of very compelling options. Just before this call, I was playing my ROG Ally, playing some Dirt 5, playing some Forza Horizon 5, playing some Parking Garage Rally Circuit, which John's also familiar with, quite a good game. And I'm really enjoying myself. So for sure, the fact that you can have Bazite or SteamOS on a device like that just makes it so much more useful and so much more compatible with the general conventions of console controller navigation. So I think this is a very positive move for the industry and for handheld gaming in general.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting is that this supposed Lenovo event is actually going to have Jason Ronald from Microsoft there. And according to this Verge report, he's being introduced as Microsoft's VP of Next Generation, which is quite interesting because the job title that we're familiar with is Microsoft VP of Xbox Game Devices and Ecosystem, which is a little less dry, I'd say, John. Tantalizing as Next Generation there.
Indeed. It's clearly something they've been thinking about a lot lately. So I think all this stuff kind of must be tying into where they're trying to go in the future with the next generation of Xbox, right? So yes, I mean, obviously with Jason being there and Xbox sort of a presence around this, they've been hovering around the portable PC space for quite a while at this point. And obviously recently they've launched the This is an Xbox campaign, which very clearly spells out that such portable PCs are indeed an Xbox in their mind. So it is interesting to see how this market has continued to shift, and it's gaining popularity big time, and everybody wants to get a part of this. And I think it's largely been considered like, I feel like this is slowly but surely sort of eating into maybe the gaming laptop space as well, where it is very desirable to have a PC like experience on a handheld, and gaming laptops, as nice and powerful as they are less convenient, right? And we'll see what Microsoft ends up doing themselves, but it also does seem like they're working with partners based on hints that we've seen anyway for this next generation of hardware.
Yeah.
So
what interests me about this is, having Valve and Microsoft at your event is quite interesting, because from my perspective, it really looks to me like Valve is encroaching in Microsoft's market quite considerably here with this expansion of SteamOS. Essentially these are Windows-based handhelds, but actually they're not anymore. You can potentially have a SteamOS experience with it as well. Also, something that I find quite interesting is that it looks as though they're going to be introducing, Lenovo that is going to be introducing at least 2 models of the Legion Go. We've got the traditional sort of handheld, kind of ROG Ally-like, and then you've got what looks like a clear successor to the Legion Go with the detachable controllers and the kind of mouse-style arrangement on that right-hand controller there.
Yep.
Oliver, do you think there's a risk that they may be oversaturating the market, or is it just simply the case that in the PC space, it's all about proliferation of designs? You can't oversaturate it.
Yeah, let a million flowers bloom, I think, in the PC market there. I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of the original Legion Go design, I have to say. I don't really see the utility in that Switch-like concept for a portable console like PC. I'd prefer to just have a separate PC for high-performance gaming and a separate console, handheld PC, I should say, for portable gaming there. I think that's the more elegant solution. And I certainly think that the Legion Go S looks quite attractive in that respect, in terms of having a very ergonomic form factor, looking very self-contained, looking very ergonomic there. I think it's really appealing looking, and I would really like to get my hands on one, frankly. But this original Legion Go concept is not as appealing to me. But I'd also have to say, I do wonder on the software side of things, if Microsoft being there, if they might be there to announce some kind of integration into SteamOS for Xbox Game Pass, because right now you can't really get Xbox Game Pass to run on SteamOS. You can get Xbox Cloud Gaming to run on SteamOS, of course, through a browser, through I think a couple other ways, but you can't get Xbox Game Pass on SteamOS. So Microsoft is a services company. They also sell operating systems, obviously, but one way to kind of lay down their arms would be to say, hey, we'll kind of go along with this. If SteamOS devices become popular, we're going to provide some venue to get our services on those SteamOS devices and achieve a larger market there. They also could just be there to say, hey, we're here to launch the Windows version of this product, if there is a Windows version of this product. I guess they could be there to announce that, but it's kind of an awkward fit, I would agree, if there wasn't some level of kind of enmeshing there between the two software companies, I think.
Yeah,
that's confusing about this topic. I'm like, wait a minute, they're both there. But that creates a problem, right? Where if they're starting to say, hey, Game Pass is now supported on SteamOS, doesn't that potentially throw a wrench in what seems to be their plans going forward for expanding Windows, right? So obviously more subscribers on Game Pass is a good thing, but Windows is kind of a critical product for Microsoft. And it feels strange, the idea of them throwing a bone to SteamOS in that way, even in, light of the This is an Xbox campaign, it feels like it's almost setting them up for, well, what's the purpose of the Xbox sort of like side of things on this, right? In Windows, if you can just use the more streamlined SteamOS.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a weird situation right now. I'm very confused, and I think a lot of people are generally confused with the direction Microsoft's trying to go here, but maybe it is just throw all of our eggs into as many baskets as possible.
Yeah.
That does seem to be the strategy, really, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Something I quickly wanted to pick your brains on, Oliver, is the leaks that were happening recently about a Valve device codenamed Fremont, which there seems to be very, very little information attached to it, but it does seem to have HDMI support, which many people have taken to mean it's going to be a Valve console. Curious what you think about that. I mean, the concept of Valve moving into the console space in a kind of restrained manner, in the way, relatively restrained manner, similar to the way Steam Deck was launched, kind of makes sense to me, I think.
Yeah. I think that from my point of view, it's probably something like the Steam Deck, where Valve basically prepares a console offering or a console-like hardware offering, and then third parties maybe follow in the wake some months or years possibly later. Certainly Brad Lynch has been looking at this and he's been posting about it, and it does seem like it's some kind of the AMD box that goes beneath your television, possibly. But there's not too much, like you said, there's not too much in terms of firm details in that machine at the moment. But I think it's exciting because I don't want to be too explicit here, too mean, but everything I don't like about Windows is not there in SteamOS. Like everything I like about Windows is there in SteamOS pretty much, and everything I don't like in Windows is not there in SteamOS. So if you can just translate this experience to a console-like device or console-like devices, or even just let me install it on my PC, that'd be fantastic. And especially if Game Pass is on there, you're really the prospects of Windows dragging you away from that are really decreasing, I think, because that seems pretty appealing.
Absolutely.
And that goes back to the previous point, right, Oliver? Where it's like, now if you had a standalone unit like this as a console, you have a handheld, all SteamOS, Game Pass is suddenly supported. Where does that leave Microsoft going forward? Because everything we've been discussing with Microsoft's next generation plans hinges on it becoming more of a PC, right? And I feel like you very specifically just said what a lot of people are thinking, where that would essentially make Windows even less desirable than it currently is. So the only way to really turn that around then would be for Microsoft to make Windows actually compelling in the same way as Steam Deck, which I'm sure they would like to do and are probably attempting.
Yeah.
But whether they can actually succeed at that remains
there is still incompatibility issues, certainly. I don't...
that's on their side, right? Like that, if they can make the experience competitive with SteamOS, they can at least boast increased compatibility.
I have tried ray tracing on SteamOS, and it's actually pretty competitive in my experience with Windows, but I've only tried it on the Steam Deck there, and on only on the Steam Deck, obviously, because that's the only device that technically runs SteamOS. I tested that out in May of this year, I believe. I've not tried it on higher end devices with really advanced ray tracing workloads, like with path tracing. I don't know if there's some kind of hitch there because I've not tested it. Maybe if I installed Bazet on my PC, I could get a better idea of that. But there are potential hurdles. Like, I don't want to say there are no hurdles. And certainly the compatibility thing, like when you go on SteamOS and you are browsing through games or in Bazet or whatever, and you do look at the little Steam Deck verified icon, oftentimes that's a circle with a cross through it, right? And you can't play those games there, or it's a circle with the yellow exclamation point, and so you have some caution there. And in a lot of those cases, those games don't run very well or at all on the device, so that's an issue that Microsoft is not really going to have, and that could be a big bonus for them if they get everything else to a level that is at least kind of comparable with the Steam Deck and SteamOS, which is a big ask. But if they can do it, then they have an inherent leg up, I think, over SteamOS in that respect.
I just think that Steam OS running Game Pass would be a match made in heaven. Microsoft would want it to happen regardless of their Windows plans. So I just think it probably is likely to happen, assuming that Valve are on board with the idea. And to be fair, Valve and Microsoft do seem to have a pretty okay / good relationship by all accounts. So why not? I mean, basically Microsoft games are on there already, to buy. So yeah,
Valve's really in a unique position now with SteamOS. If they can leverage this and they already have the mobile space. Then let's say they get into this sort of like Steam machine world again, only this time hopefully find success. But then there's also been talk about this potential standalone VR headset, which could also run a version of SteamOS, or essentially, Steam VR on there, right? And you could tie this whole ecosystem of products all together via SteamOS in a very unified fashion, which then even extends over to the PC, frankly, with big screen mode and just Steam in general. And it really feels like Valve is making inroads into this market in a way that might be difficult for Microsoft to match at this point going forward, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Okay, well, certainly going to be following this one with much interest, but for now, let's move on. Okay, so obviously one of the big draws of CES 2025 is going to be the reveal of the Blackwell line of RTX GPUs from NVIDIA. And, well, what can I say? There's been a massive array of tech spec leaks. Almost the entire stack, apart from the 5060 at this point, seems to be pretty much locked in. You can find those specs all over the internet. Now, what's interesting here is, well, we can sum it up with this question from Diehard X86. He says, "Hello, DF. I've been seeing chatter from PC Gamer via Inno3D and mad Reddit posts about neural rendering being the next big step in NVIDIA's technology roadmap. Have you seen or heard NVIDIA mention neural rendering, or is this news to you as well? The thought of machine learning models not only to upscale, but to create 3D environments in real time, exciting stuff." Now, let's talk about the Inno3D leak, where basically there seems to be a range of bullet points, which I suspect that NVIDIA isn't particularly happy to have leaked. However, with that said, they are still sufficiently vague enough to act almost as a teaser of sorts. They're talking about advanced DLSS technology. Well, we would expect a new generation of cards to come with a new DLSS. Enhanced ray tracing, ditto. AI accelerated graphics, well, what's that all about? Neural rendering capabilities. This is all new and interesting stuff. They've also talked about, well, there's actually some sort of screenshot of an Inno3D PR blast here, which seems to be offering up some further details. Neural rendering capabilities revolutionizing how graphics are processed and displayed. I've got to go to you for your thoughts on this one, Oliver.
Yeah, I mean, it could mean a lot of things. I don't really know.
Yeah.
It could mean integration of AI models at different steps of the rendering process. It could mean something like certain post-process techniques brought in, but given that they're talking about a revolution here, doesn't seem like a revolution to me to throw in AI as a post-process potentially. The other things here, I mean, advanced DLSS tech, I think that could just be some improvement to image upscaling and frame gem potentially. That's sort of what's implied here because they're talking about better image quality, better frame rates. That would make more sense there. I am really curious about the AI video upscaling that they're talking about here, because could that be something similar to Topaz, for instance, but faster, possibly, potentially in real time? That would be very exciting. Potentially, you're streaming a game, let's just say, and you're getting this filter, this AI filter that's running on top of it on your RTX GPU, and it's improving the video quality of that stream substantially in a way that we don't see with NVIDIA's current solution there, where it's a more minor enhancement in line with other kinds of video enhancement techniques that we see currently. Or maybe just in general with internet stream content, that could be quite nice. I'd also be kind of curious to see how much this ends up being supported by prior RTX cards. Older 40 series, 30 series, 20 series. Nothing here like screams 50 series or newer potentially for that extra functionality. Again, I don't know, but with the 40 series, you had DLSS 3, which for its frame generation component required more intensive, higher end optical flow acceleration, which was provided by a dedicated unit on that card. So that necessity presumably maybe wouldn't be here for some of these other things. Maybe they would apply to older RTX series cards as well. So yeah, I'm not quite too sure about that neural rendering thing. I'm just very curious. Like, the more I think about it, I am really curious to see what NVIDIA does. And I think it could be, it could go in any number of different directions, but I think what they will demo with it will probably be very interesting and very compelling.
I mean, from my perspective, AI hardware on GPUs has basically been used for vendor-specific stuff like DLSS, right? I think the way forward is just to open it all up. We've had DirectML, which basically doesn't seem to have done anything. There doesn't seem to have been any impact whatsoever. I think there probably needs to be some kind of new API to actually access this hardware and be able to get more out of it. So I suspect maybe something along those lines, something to actually make this hardware more useful to developers, as opposed to effectively, operating almost like a fixed function block, really. You've got all of these tensor cores in there and they're being used for DLSS and DLSS only. I'd love to see all of that hardware being made available to developers to use as they wish. That would be fantastic. I mean, let's take a look at some of the other bullet points here. I agree with you. Advanced DLSS technology. Well, DLSS has basically become a must-have feature for people buying graphics cards, right? So what do? You don't sit on your laurels. You basically push harder. You do better. That's basically been what NVIDIA has done across, ever since Turing came out. They've iterated, they've improved. Is this going to be an iteration, or is it going to be something much, much bigger? I can't wait to find out. Enhanced ray tracing. It's really interesting. The backlash against ray tracing continues, but then, you listen to the Mark Cerny talk for PlayStation 5 Professional and the interview that you did, Oliver. We'll talk a bit more about that later. Basically the people that matter, the architects of the hardware of the future, realizing that rasterization is kind of reaching its limits and ray tracing is, the Wild West. It's the new frontier. And we've kind of just started that journey, remarkably. AI accelerated graphics. Again, I still think it's about giving that hardware to developers. So, there's a lot to go, a lot to what can I say? There's a lot of potential here. I just really want to see what the presentations are going to deliver in January there. John, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, when talking about neural rendering capabilities and additional uses of the AI acceleration, you really have to start thinking about the different pipelines going into what makes up a frame, right?
Yeah.
We're already seeing DLSS intercept certain things and taking control of that final output to deliver improved image quality. But what if you insert it earlier into the process or for some other sort of rendering tasks that are happening? And so this just a random example, and with their focus on ray tracing wouldn't even necessarily make sense here. But imagine if you were able to intercept the pipeline for displaying screen space reflections, right? And use machine learning to sort of extend out what it's actually capable of drawing. So it's no longer just like SSR. It's actually like drawing information from somewhere else using machine learning to sort of extrapolate what may or may not be outside the frame, or inserting it into like a pixel shader of some sort and sort of like interpreting the results and maybe enhancing it, basically finding ways to like stick it into the various like rendering pipeline bits to improve the end result. I mean, we've seen them dabbling this with things like Omniverse and RTX Remix, I believe, right? So that was kind of a pitch that we've seen before, but applying this at a larger scale to shipped games and such could be very interesting, I think, for the display of graphics, and would be a cool way to use these sort of AI features that have largely gone mostly untapped, I would say, at this point. Like these specifications and what it's capable of doing sort of outstrip what's actually being used in games at this point. And with the next generation coming up, there's going to be even more headroom there. So it makes sense to leverage that in new ways, which I guess we'll find out what that is soon enough.
Mm-hmm. The only question mark for me really is the extent to which these features are going to actually be capable of running on older hardware. It sounds like there's a lot of state-of-the-art technology coming, right? And I think the danger would be in basically only allowing it to run on the new cards. I suspect maybe, some stuff possibly will take some time to proliferate into games. And I guess that might be okay if it only ran on 50 series and above. But, a new DLSS, for example, it would be a tough sell for that not to be available on 40 series, especially bearing in mind how contentious 40 series was across the board in terms of its pricing. So I think some sort of level of balancing between what you can run on 50 series and what you can run on anything up to the old 20 series is going to be required there to make a sort of crowd-pleasing pitch from NVIDIA in that respect. I don't think you could have a DLSS 4 that only ran, and again, I was going to say that only ran on 50 series when, maybe that's not the case, bearing in mind DLSS 3 only ran on 40 series.
But that was introducing a fundamentally very different
the frame
aspect,
gen component of DLSS 3. Yeah.
Exactly, the frame gen component.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
with this, it's all about increasing, I would imagine, efficiency to produce better looking imagery at a lower performance cost, right?
Yeah, and you'd expect that model to be sort of backported to older NVIDIA hardware as well. That's the only sort of slightly worrying thing that I'm thinking about at the moment. With that said, 40 series, hugely controversial in terms of, user reaction online. However, it's sold massive amounts of units, which is quite remarkable. But yeah, well, what can I say?
I think the Halo product continues to work, by the way. When you have high-end products like the 4090, even though the price was ridiculous, people look at that and they strive for that.
Yeah.
They buy up as close as they can get to it. Well, it works.
I actually had a DM from one of the supporters saying that the whole economics of buying a graphics card, he buys the new generation every time it comes out and sells the old one. Because, what he's suggesting is that while the prices of the newer products have gone up or at best the same, he's suggesting that what this is causing is higher residual prices for the older generation cards. So he's actually suggesting a different economics model. Typically a user's expected to buy a graphics card and keep it for 3 or 4 years, let's say. But he's saying he buys every single generation simply because the price that he gets back from his existing GPU is significantly higher. Therefore, the fundamental cost of the new GPU is quote unquote lower, which is certainly an interesting way to look at things. But anyway, at CES 2025, NVIDIA, they're going to be running the keynote there. We're expecting to see some amazing stuff. I hope to see some amazing stuff. Obviously, we've had that slight tease of the Witcher 4 cinematic, which was apparently running pre-rendered, which doesn't say much to me, really. But I guess we'll get to see some surprises on that front too, hopefully. But only time will tell. Okay, with that, let's move on. Okay, it's that time of the year, the end of the year, and Alan from the Discord, the legendary Alan from the Digital Foundry Discord, has put together, or rather organised, the second annual Digital Foundry Members Awards. This is a Herculean effort in basically polling our supporters for their best games of the year. Basically, we've got, Game of the Year, most anticipated game of 2025, and we have the VR awards. A few asterisks here. So the award is for games released on all systems between December the 1st, 2023 and December the 1st, 2024. So this does mean that games like Indiana Jones and the Great Circle and Alien Rogue Incursion VR have been omitted. We've also allowed DLC similar to the Game Awards, which, that's just an argument that nobody's ever going to resolve, I don't think. Alan would like to thank the awards team for their help. That's Zephyr on the technical front, Trogginson on the data front, and Joe Esposito for art. It's quite an enterprise going on here. Let's kick off, I think, with, first of all, the VR games of the year. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the VR games as a top 5 here, and because there weren't so many votes, understandably. Number 5, Arizona Sunshine Remake. Number 4, Resident Evil 4 Remake VR. Number 3, Gran Turismo 7. That's interesting. It's beaten out with 2 games that are occupying the top slot. Metro Awakening and Batman Arkham Shadow. Quite an interesting result there, John, as our resident VR expert. I was kind of expecting Arkham Shadow to run away with it, but that said, I don't really know much about Metro Awakening. So what do you think of this?
I've played both of them.
Yep.
I'm also surprised by the appearance of Metro because I think it's good, but it feels a little bit like baby's first VR shooter in that. So we're 4 years past the release of Half-Life Alyx. We've had stuff like Boneworks, obviously Bone Lab is out. There's a bunch of others, right? Metro Awakening, I feel, has too many slow moments, which frankly is a problem with the Metro series in general, where you're often forced to just sit there and watch people talk about things for a long time. And the thing about Metro dialogue is I never really find it all that interesting. It's just, oh yeah, this is the worst place I've ever lived. Everything's bad. What do you think, Artyom? Kind of thing like that, right? It's the same kind of thing here.
That's
but
amazing, John.
The problem is
a career in narrative design.
Maybe I should at this point. But this has a lot of those problems. That the thing about VR I find is like just when you're not doing much and just twiddling your thumbs, the feeling of the VR headset becomes slightly annoying, and you're just kind of like sitting there, kind of like, get on with it. You know what I mean? It's like okay, we got it. Let's go. You want to get to the action, and it takes a long time to get into it, and there's not enough of it. And I found the action not as satisfying as I would have hoped. But it's still. I played it on Quest, actually, so Quest 3. It actually looks pretty darn good for a Quest game, for one. We don't have that many shooters quite like this on the Quest as is, so I could see that as well. It's kind of like, it really is like a take on Half-Life Alyx, but less good. In a way, is how I would describe it.
Okay.
That's why I was very excited about Aliens, which I haven't had a chance to play yet, but that actually was more exciting to me for that reason, because it did seem to like run with those themes more. But I can see that depending on where you are at in your VR journey, Metro Awakening might be more or less impressive, right? Because I've been playing VR for 10 years now, I would say, roughly, since the DK1 even. And this doesn't feel that fresh to me. Versus Batman, which again, you know, the caveat that I did a little contracting work with Batman, I really think it's an amazing game. It's extremely well done, like absolutely mind-blowingly well done. I mean, because they managed to actually successfully translate that Arkham experience to VR in a way that didn't necessarily seem possible at first, but it's more like Arkham Asylum, and then it's much more constrained. The main part of the game takes place in Blackgate Prison, so you're in the prison, but the conceit here is that during the day you're basically undercover as a prisoner, and at night you sneak out through your cell and become the Batman. So you're kind of seeing the prison from both angles, so you get that almost, I've been saying it a lot lately, but this Riddick-like experience of being in the prison, talking to inmates, exploring it on foot during the day, dealing with the guards. But then at night, you're like, it's a huge facility. You're going all over the place as Batman, and you're getting different objectives and getting into different fights, gaining new gadgets to proceed through the world. And it's long, it's interesting. The storytelling, I think, is really good. There's just a lot going on here that makes it like a genuine Arkham experience, but in VR. And it just feels great. The mechanics, the fact that they were able to translate this sort of brawling mechanics into VR. Once you really get into the flow, it has a great feel to it, especially with the use of sort of slow motion and sort of accentuating the animations. Like when you throw out a fist, take out a guy, and it's like you kind of let your fist linger in air as he slow motion tumbles into the back. That always feels great. So I'm happy to see that a lot of people here also seemingly enjoyed it on our Discord, and I can certainly understand why. Mm-hmm. The only real caveat with this, and I guess this is a lot of these games, I feel like the Quest has reached the point where when you have high-end VR games, you kind of need to be using Quest Game Optimizer. You want to overclock the heck out of this thing, and you want to increase the resolution. Right. And if you do that, you end up with absolutely stunning visuals. But by default, the meta clock speeds and everything, and this sort of like pursuit of battery life does sort of keep some of the visuals from reaching their peak. But thankfully, it's an open platform, so you can do what you want.
Wow, amazing. Oliver, any comments on this selection of games?
On VR titles, not too much. The only one on this list that I played a lot of is Gran Turismo 7, and I also played a lot of RE4 Remake in VR, which is also very fun. I love Gran Turismo 7. I have to say, though, that Drive Club in VR maybe still edges it out in terms of my own personal enjoyment.
Really?
Yeah. Although Gran Turismo 7 is a much better audio visual experience on a PSVR 2 than Drive Club on a PSVR 1. but I prefer the gameplay a little bit of Drive Club a little bit. And
right.
also,
I don't blame.
part of it, I guess, is that when I did play Drive Club on PSVR 1, I also had a racing wheel set up, so that also tilts it a bit. Now I'm just using a controller, so perhaps that's coloring.
You got to get
coloring,
a wheel, man. It feels incredible in GT7.
Yeah. I need to figure out how I can reorient my apartment to give me enough room for another wheel. I know you always regret a wheel, but you don't regret it for the first week when you're toying around with it. So.
Exactly. Everybody's like, don't buy a racing wheel, but then you buy it and it's like, this is the best thing ever for a week.
Yeah. So maybe I need to consider that. But yeah, I mean, I'm glad that games continue to be released on VR and people seem to continue to enjoy them for sure, especially on those Oculus platforms with Batman and whatnot. I think that's very encouraging.
Yeah. I want to give a shout out. It's on the list as having one vote, but Triangle Strategy, that conversion, especially once I did the Quest Game Optimizer and boosted the resolution a lot, making it super clear. That game in VR is incredible. Like having a Final Fantasy Tactics-like experience in VR, where essentially you have this gigantic pixel art 3D diorama with all these beautiful sprite characters laid out before you. You can play it either with its own background around it, or you can play it in mixed reality mode. And like, I sort of attached the game board itself to my large dining room table and just like kind of walk around the table, and it feels like you're just like looking at this little, like it really is like a little diorama, like you're playing a board game with tactics. And the way they map all the stuff to like your wrist, like you can see the turn order and your menus, you pull it up on your left hand, but when you roll out your hand, you actually see like the whole list kind of like flick out from your wrist. It feels very satisfying. It's a cool game. Recommended.
Awesome. Let's move on to actual Game of the Year results now. We're going to do the top 10, but before we do the top 10, there's a couple of games that are just outside the top 10, marginally, that maybe we should talk about. Palatvo is there. Stalker 2, Heart of Chernobyl there. Black Myth Wukong. Like a Dragon, Infinite Wealth. Those are actually some really, really good games that just lurked outside of the top 10 there. I'm actually going to talk about voting numbers here with this one as well. Okay, so top 10. Number 10 with 11 votes. Warhammer 40k, Space Marine 2. Can't really argue with that one. Excellent game. Number 9, Dragon Age, The Veil Guard. 12 votes for that one. Silent Hill 2. Number 8, 15 votes. Stellar Blade. Number 7, 21 votes. Number 6 with 22 votes. That's Senua's Saga, Hellblade 2. Surprisingly high, in my opinion, but certainly has plenty of merits. Coming in at number 5 with 28 votes. That's Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erd Tree, which says to me that it's okay to put DLC and expansions into your Game of the Year. You know, people obviously...
Alan did it.
People obviously want to vote for it, right? Coming in at number 4, 31 votes, Helldivers 2. Metaphor, ReFantasio, that's in at number 3 with 33 votes. Actually, it's a joint number 2 because Final Fantasy VII Rebirth also has 33 votes. Now, you might be saying that the vote tallies are actually quite low at this point, but that's simply down to the range of games, because at number 1 with 145 votes, Astrobot. So this is quite interesting, really, because it's like number 1 is John's pick, and then number 2 is basically Oliver's pick. Like Game of the Year from the way I see things. Maybe I'm wrong. Oliver, have I got that right?
Well, you'll have to wait and see if you've gotten that one right, I suppose. But I mean, Metaphor ReFantasio is a fantastic game. Obviously, I covered that earlier this year, as is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I think both are worthy Game of the Year contenders in that respect. Metaphor basically being the perfect evolution, I think, of Atlus's Persona game design. It's not a Persona title, but in almost every respect, it takes elements from the Persona titles and marries it to a kind of fantasy and very politically oriented storyline that is very interesting and is quite long. And there's also, obviously, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth does a great job of retelling that middle part of the Final Fantasy VII storyline and marrying it with the great action combat that Final Fantasy VII Remake introduced as well. But I'm also extremely fond of Astrobot. I've played a lot of Astrobot. It's just such a novel game, such a special game. So many bespoke little challenges, so many special little bosses there. So much great physics in there as well. It's a real treat in a lot of respects, and it checks a lot of boxes, not just in terms of being a great game and a visually exciting game, but also being a great tribute to 30 years of PlayStation history there. So I think that top 3, and indeed the top 10 here, I'm not really finding anything that I'd necessarily disagree with. I do find the inclusion of Hellblade 2 to be a little bit curious, like you say, Rich, but I think for our audience, they're obviously very interested in the cinematic, technical, and visual presentation of these titles. And certainly Hellblade 2 is pretty much faultless in all those respects. So I can understand it coming from our audience. They might place a higher emphasis on those traits for sure.
Mm-hmm. John, any comments?
Yeah, so that is indeed interesting. I like this list a lot. Astrobot, of course, I loved very much. We'll have to see if it hits number 1 on my list or not, but I agree with the audience. It's very novel. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth as well is an interesting one, because that one, it might have made my... That's not actually on my Game of the Year list. I can spoil right now. Even though I put 30 hours into it, there's still so much to go that I didn't feel like I could put it in until I actually saw it through. So that's kind of like one of those maybe titles that might have ended up there if I had more time. And Metaphor as well is a game I want to play and have not had a chance to dive in at all. I was interested, though, with the inclusion of Hellblade 2, but then I realized that we're talking about the DF supporters here, right? So they're naturally inclined to love high technology. And what better game on this list is there than Hellblade 2, right? So even though the game itself is very simple in design and it's streamlined and sort of a cinematic thing, it's insanely beautiful. It's one of the best looking games I think ever made. So I can see why people would have gravitated towards that. Plus the storytelling itself is quite powerful, I would argue.
Yeah. I mean, Astrobot basically had a 4.4 times multiplier in votes over the number 2 entries there.
It's that good, though. It's just pure fun. And it's a game. It's one of those games I think that doesn't have an ounce of fat on its bones. It's just basically perfect. Like everything about it, the control, the level design, the progression through it, all the little things you do. There's like no friction there, but like negative friction, I would say. There is friction in terms of some of the challenges later, which is good. But man, it's perfect execution, and I'm so happy to see people embrace and love a platform game again, because it's one of my favorite genres, but it's one that's largely, I feel like, been underrepresented in the larger scale as of late, and like general gaming culture feels like it's kind of abandoned them outside of Mario. And so I'm happy to see that people can still love and appreciate a Japanese developed good old-fashioned platform game, basically, because that's what they did, right? That's what this is all about.
Absolutely.
And brilliant game.
Let's talk about most anticipated game of 2025, or most anticipated game. I'm not sure there was a 2025 requirement for it. No real surprises here. Grand Theft Auto 6 is number 1. Not surprising.
Of course.
Over twice as many votes as the number 2 entry, which is Death Stranding 2 on the beach. That's followed by Doom: The Dark Ages, followed by Avowed, Ghost of Yotai, Metro Prime 4 Beyond, Kingdom Come Deliverance. This one I thought was quite interesting. The PlayStation version of Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. I guess that would be anticipated.
Understandable.
Yep. Followed up by Fable and Monster Hunter Wilds. I think that accounts for the top 10 as it stands. Yeah, I believe so. But yeah, good stuff. So thanks to our supporters and indeed to Alan for putting that together. I'd say that's a highly respectable list all round. So quite pleased about that. But with that, let's move on. A final news story of the year. And John, it's back to the Nintendo eShop for some classic shovelware and horrific IP abuse. In the form of, what's the name of the game again? Monkey Kong in New York hyphenated, which is quite an interesting way of presenting that. Well, this is basically a rip-off of Donkey Kong using Donkey Kong's original name, which is quite an interesting turn of events. Somehow it's ended up on the Nintendo Switch eShop, despite horrifically abusing some Nintendo IP. But come on, you've got to tell us all about the game here. I bought it. You've played it. What's it all about?
Yes, this is amusing. It's an auto-scrolling runner for the Switch, basically, using some of the worst slash best character art I think I've ever seen. It is the titular Monkey Kong himself that you control, and there are other white Monkey Kongs throughout.
What?
And they have 2 frames of animations, one with their legs out, one with the legs in, and it just sort of cycles, and the screen scrolls to the right, and you tap buttons to jump while collecting bananas and avoiding the white monkeys.
Okay.
And that's it. So it has no relation to anything other than just feeling like the cheapest of the cheap sort of mobile phone game. But I will give them this. What frame rate do you think it runs at?
I wouldn't have any idea. I mean, you'd expect 60 frames per second, but after some of the abominations I've seen on the eShop, who knows?
Well, I'm happy to inform you, Rich, that it does indeed run at 60 frames per
Wow.
second.
Okay.
They have accomplished something that the developers of The Last Hope, Dead Zone Rising never could dream of, an actual smooth frame rate.
I can enjoy both of those frames of Donkey Kong's animation at 60 frames per second. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. Yes, Monkey Kong and his animations. I should also note that when you first start the game, before he starts running with his 2 frames of animation, he has 2 frames specifically to his head going up and down like this. Like he's like to the music, bouncing his head, but then he starts to run, and it's just those 2 frames. It has a vaguely New York inspired city background, I suppose. There's occasionally tires rolling across the scene.
It's just like real life.
It just kind of keeps going. I mean, I guess if you're like a lapsed Cannabalt fan and you're just thinking like, man, I wish I could go right on my Switch and occasionally jump, Monkey Kong in New York has you covered.
What particularly amuses me is that on the Switch eShop, the web version, there's a screenshot gallery, and the screenshot gallery has all of the frames of animation of Monkey Kong contained within the 6 screenshots with duplicates.
Yes. It's all there. The thing that amazes me about this and a lot of the other, like this one's less egregious than some, but there's a lot of shovelware on the Switch, right? Like a lot. Yet the approval processes for getting your indie game on the Switch are surprisingly challenging, and they often reject things for reasons that are not clear.
Well, explain this then.
That's what I'm trying to say. I don't understand. Like, how are these companies able to get this kind of stuff on the Switch when other legitimate games, not to say that this is not legitimate, I mean, it's Monkey Kong 2, come on now, struggle to get on the store? Like, it's very, very strange, this kind of stuff. I mean, I guess this game at least functions, unlike that, like, it was like Call of Prison Duty, Battlefield Simulator, whatever, which was basically non-functional. This is actually functional. So
I just don't know what to say about this, because it kind of suggests that, anybody and everybody can get their hands on Switch development hardware and submit games and get them onto the eStore, even if you're basically literally ripping off Nintendo's own IP.
Imagine for a moment, Rich, that this is a launch game for Switch 2. They do a Switch 2 version running at 120 frames per second.
Yeah, and you get 4 frames of animation on the main character.
Sorry, Rich, they're just interpolated.
Yeah, it's frame generation.
They don't have the budget for that. Come on now.
Oliver, I don't know what to say about this. Have you got any comments?
No, I just find this description funny. Get ready to explore the Big Apple like never before in Monkey Kong in New York. A daring ape on a mission to conquer New York's most iconic locations. Harlem, Manhattan, the New York Harbor. Sounds very exciting. Do you think this was inspired by New Donk City there, John? Possibly from Odyssey.
Possibly.
Yeah, does it seem like that?
Possibly. No, it just seems like they have a lot of poorly aligned parallax backgrounds that often show their seams when they probably shouldn't.
I just don't quite understand. I just don't quite get how this all works. Maybe some sort of project for 2025 is that we do a Nintendo Switch shovelware game, just to go through the process to see how it actually works. How do you do it?
Oh man, I should We should really consider that. That would be that would be a great video series. Let's make shovelware for the Switch.
But it does highlight an issue here. I mean, Monkey Kong in New York, surely Nintendo itself would have noticed that there is some sort of IP violation going on here. But apparently not.
Well, I mean, didn't they argue back in court over Donkey Kong how Donkey Kong was not an infringement on the King Kong license? There was a whole court case over that. I forget the exact results, but if they were to challenge this now, they would essentially take the role of Universal Pictures or whoever it was they were suing back in the day. So they kind of just have to let it go. This whole game feels almost like a big middle finger to Nintendo in some way. Like, I don't know, man.
Amazing scenes.
I mean, it's clearly not Donkey Kong, but it's just like a giant cartoon ape. But at the same time, when you call it Monkey Kong, come on now.
Well, the artwork does look kind of reminiscent of the original Donkey Kong sort of coin-op artwork.
Reminiscent, yes.
I would say.
My goodness. This freaking game, man.
So did you enjoy your experience or...
No.
No. Okay, fair enough. Okay, so that's that. That's the end of the news. Let's move on to Supporter Q&A. It's the part of the show where every week we petition our supporters on Patreon for questions to add to the show. We choose the ones that are the best / the ones we're best equipped to answer. I was actually quite taken aback by the fact that maybe half of the questions this week were all about the Mark Cerny presentation and the interview that Oliver did. So I've actually grouped together 2 batches of questions, which we'll kind of address as 2 distinct sections. So let's crack on. We're going to start with questions like this. Groovy Duck says, "Hello, gents. I was really glad to hear Mark Cerny shout you guys out in his presentation. That must have felt good for you guys, not to mention him directly complimenting DF in the interview. What was the conversation like with Sony in organising Oliver's excellent interview? Did Yoel send a letter asking if you could, or did they reach out? Some guy person says, now that you guys have been able to talk openly regarding the Mark Cerny interview, do you think there's only more credence towards adding 3D V-Cache to the PS6? Additional cache helps out CPU performance, GPU performance, allows you to keep at least part of the BVH in cache, and allows you to put much larger AI workflows all in cache. More than ever, it just seems that cache is king right now. Rich, are you finally on board the 3D V-Cache on PS6 train? Choo-choo! Exclamation point. This one from Dudley the Gentleman. Hi DF crew, the reveal of Project Amethyst. I'm curious as to how custom a semi-custom part can be. AMD CPU, GPU and APU roadmaps are decided years in advance. What significant input can Sony give to AMD's IP in terms of future hardware design that amounts to more than the number of Zen X and UDNA X cores for a console APU? Separate question, will Sony's traditional approach to back compat when it comes to APU design potentially limit how forward-looking the PS6 APU could be? I'm quickly going to attack the cache question. Clearly, the PlayStation 5 Pro had some bandwidth issues. They're just trying to get so much out of that memory, and there were some innovative solutions to that. Cache, though, it's extremely expensive. It's a massive silicon investment, and I'm still not really on board the V-Cache for PS6 train. Don't know what you think about that, Oliver, based on, you were the man at the event.
That's true. I think it's a lot of extra die area. Like I think in line with what Alex has been talking about with the PS6 GPU, I think there is a case to be made that it should have a lot more cache than the PS5 Pro GPU and the PS5 GPU. But a separate die and stacking and all the complexity that it introduces, it doesn't feel very console-like to me. That feels much more PC-like. And also, the kind of gains you get in CPU performance, like maybe a 20% bump in a PC part, a high-end PC part, that's very meaningful. In a console, is it that meaningful for that extra cost? I'm not too sure myself. I don't really think that's the way they would go. I could be wrong. I don't think that's the way they would go. In terms of the logistics, it's not too complex. I think they reached out to Rich with the opportunity. And I'm very close, or comparatively quite close to the Sony HQ because I live in the west coast of Canada. So it made sense to send me. And I finished my Dragon Age video, and then I was on a flight there, and then I did the interview. I got on a flight back. It was pretty simple. Nothing too onerous or strange. And then in terms of the machine learning accelerations, Sony has some input into that. The changes to RDNA that Sony needed to run PSSR and CNNs efficiently didn't really seem that huge. It seemed like a pretty lightweight customization, and I would expect that anything that was more involved than that would probably need some buy-in from AMD as well, I would presume there. Yeah, the backwards compatibility, that's going to be a tough ask for PS6 potentially. They need to have binary compatibility, but I'm sure they will find a solution there. But certainly that was a short-term impediment to them adopting RDNA 3 or more of RDNA 3 in the PS5 Pro design, or potentially RDNA 4, although we don't know what that looks like at the moment.
Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be some level of backwards compatibility basically baked in at the core design level, simply because the concept of running a PlayStation digital library is basically crucial to the success of the system, as it was for the PS5 before it. So it's kind of got to be in there, and it's got to be in there at the basic architectural level, which I find quite fascinating. But yeah, I mean, in terms of, we don't really even know what UDNA-X is. We're expecting it to be some sort, UDNA rather. We expect it to be some sort of amalgamation of all of these technologies that are sort of emerging at this point. Ray tracing, you want the traditional raster element, you want machine learning elements in there. I'm wondering if PS5 Pro is some kind of early indicator of the approach that they're going to take with that. But again, we don't really know what UDNA really is at this point. You expect it to be like a unified design. I don't really think there's too much more we can say about it at this point. I just think that obviously when the notion came about that the PS5 Pro would have 300 tops, there was some sort of assumption that there would be dedicated silicon for the machine learning side. But I actually think that the solution they came up with is limited in some respects, but obviously rather ingenious, similar to the ray tracing solution. It's, when you're dealing with consoles, the importance of die space, the importance of area, it's a defining factor of how much the system is going to cost. And, you can't have gigantically expensive consoles. I mean, I guess with the exception of the PS5 Pro itself, which is designed for a niche audience, they can get away with it there. They can have a $700 price point, but going forward, it's going to be much, much more challenging. And, going back to some of the things that maybe are being unearthed or showcased for the first time in the NVIDIA 2025 event, I'm wondering if we're looking at a complete sort of re-architecting of what we should expect from graphics technology or game technology going forward, and maybe that encompasses UDNA as well. Obviously it's a fascinating insight into the into the way PlayStation 5 Pro was put together, and I suppose it was nice to get a shout out from Mark Cerny. Great. I'm just happy the interview turned out really, really good as well. They were very forthcoming about that within, it's always a case of figuring out, where you're going to get the best answers, because there are some sort of what you might call sledgehammer questions that, okay, you've got Mark Cerny in a room, let's ask about PS6. He's never going to talk about PS6, but at the same time, as a journalist, your audience is going to expect you to ask those questions. And I think what was quite good about the way you handled it, Oliver, was that we actually got quite a lot of insight into what we should be expecting from future designs, and how that translates into the, dare I say it, here and now. But yeah, that was really great stuff. Any comments on all of this there, John?
Just to say, yeah, Oliver did an awesome job on that interview. And by not asking questions like, so what does this mean for PlayStation 6? Tell me about PlayStation 6, stuff like that. You're never going to get an answer on those things. So you were very skillful and sort of almost like dodging bullets a la the Matrix on your way to getting good answers.
But I think we actually found
without
out,
shutting down the conversation.
We found out a lot about the philosophy that's going to be going into the next hardware design, which almost certainly is well in development at this point. Yeah.
So how do we close the gap between this and the PlayStation 9 that was advertised back in the PS2 days, right? The little glass sphere thing. There's got to be a path to get to the PS9.
I should have asked Mark about that. Maybe he'd be more forthcoming about the path to
Ask
the
about
PS9.
the PS9, yeah.
Okay, let's move on to our next PlayStation 5 Pro question, or rather questions, because we've had a number of them which are basically asking the same thing. Let's go through a few of them. Snorlax Jobless asks, do you believe that the Sony Interactive / AMD initiative rules out AMD as the next Xbox chipset? Or is this like the Cell PowerPC where the engineers will end up using one's own tech enhancements with the other company? A bespoke exclamation point, nice handle there, says, with Mark Cerny confirming a deeper partnership with AMD, do you think this is confirmation that Microsoft has ditched AMD for next gen? I can't see Sony wanting AMD to share their work with Xbox, and there have been rumours that the Surface team is now also the Xbox hardware team, so using ARM and a variation of those quote-unquote Surface tops they just released would allow them to launch quote-unquote early. It would definitely make more work for you guys, but also much more exciting questions. I like this bit. Rich, exclamation point. You don't take the lead on any questions, so would you like to take point on this one? Not really. Paul Calamata asks, how do you think Sony's hardware development partnership with AMD through Amethyst may impact Microsoft's next generation hardware development plans? Could this push Microsoft towards seeking an alternative hardware partner to AMD? Or could they potentially be using a chip that powered by tech that was partially developed and owned by Sony? I think this was actually a question that was raised by one of the other outlets that interviewed Mark Cerny, and Mark didn't really seem too bothered about whether it was in an Xbox or not. But if I do want to take the lead on this question, even though Oliver is better equipped to answer it, I would say that Microsoft are still going to stick with AMD. It just makes sense on many levels. But Oliver, what do you make of all of this? I don't think you can rule out Microsoft using AMD. I'd say it's quite likely at this point, even though there would be a great deal of potential plus points to potentially using NVIDIA.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'd love it if Microsoft took a bit of a left turn in the console ecosystem. I guess, well, not too much of a left turn because Nintendo is going down the same path, but picking NVIDIA for a high-performance box, that would be really exciting. There are a lot of really compelling technologies that NVIDIA already has brought to the table, and it sounds like will be bringing to the table that leave them some years ahead of their competitors. I'd have to judge there. But no, I think the next Xbox will be AMD. It's hard, I'd imagine, for anyone else to guarantee backwards compatibility. I think that's critical. With this stuff with Sony and Microsoft and AMD, I think Sony is probably fine with contributing as long as they feel like they have a competitive edge over Microsoft in other respects. And I think here that the next Xbox probably won't be trying to compete with Sony as directly as prior Xboxes did. So whatever issues there are there won't be as much friction between the two vendors. And then also you have to think about this in a holistic way. And over time, we've already had 2 generations of Sony and Microsoft drinking from the same trough there with AMD. So certainly they're no strangers to there possibly being some cross-pollination between those designs. And it has not affected their enthusiasm for continuing to go with AMD for subsequent products. So I think in this case, it's going to be AMD for the next Xbox.
Interesting. I mean, thinking about it, John, you and I interviewed Microsoft's lead architect for Xbox, and they were all in on ray tracing pretty much from 2016. They wanted it to be in that box for the launch in 2020. So therefore, they went to AMD and said, we need an area efficient ray tracing solution for the next Xbox. They saw the direction of travel, what with working with NVIDIA. Obviously, DXR became a thing. And lo and behold, hardware accelerated ray tracing ends up in PlayStation 5, and early development hardware didn't have it, which kind of suggests this is like a two-way street, right?
Precisely. Exactly what I was thinking. I mean, this is the same song and dance they've been doing for a while now, and I don't really see any reason for them to necessarily change that at this point. There is that theory about using something like ARM in their box, and I guess given the range of devices that could become an Xbox according to the marketing, that could make sense. But I feel like on the main Xbox side, one of the key one of the key selling points that they've maintained for a while now is backwards compatibility, and shifting the whole architecture so dramatically would create gigantic challenges, I think, for backwards compatibility, especially with the most recent generation of Xbox software, right? So, I mean, it just seems to me like they're going to stick with AMD.
Yeah, I think that's probably the case, and I don't think there's any sort of challenge to the relationships. Just
No.
makes sense, really. Let's move on to the next question. This one comes from Daniel Pepper. Hi DFT, exclamation point, long time listener here, first time question poser. With the next generation of gaming consoles due at some point in the next 3 to 4 years, and considering Mr. Cerny's recent comments about machine learning, how do you expect current high-end PC hardware to compare? Will an RTX 5090 or even 4090 be able to outperform the PS6/Next box in future console ports for years to come? Also, with rumours of Rubin architecture forecasted earlier than expected, is it even worth buying into the 50 series of cards? Or should PC gamers wait around for the inevitable 60 series? All the best! Exclamation point. Well, why not hang about for 70 or 80 series while we're at it? Ultimately, upgrades are driven by the fact that, you've got a PC, you don't think it's performing well or well enough, and you want to buy something new, and you buy what's available. I say there's only really a sort of argument for waiting if we're in a period like now where we know there's going to be hardware appearing very, very soon. So I don't think there's any sort of reason to prolong an upgrade. I can't see, how long are we talking here? A year, 2 years? We don't really know. But if it's a year, that's a long time to wait. Oliver, what do you think high-end PC hardware will look like? I mean, we're talking about like the next 3 to 4 years, so 2027 to 2028. Inevitably, the next generation of high-end PC hardware is still going to be a lot better than a console, right? I mean, that's just the way it works.
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly high-end PC hardware in 3 or 4 years is going to be way ahead of the consoles that launch in a similar time period. But I think even with like a 4090 or a 5090, I think it'll be pretty far ahead, just in part because NVIDIA is so far ahead in terms of DLSS frame generation, DLSS ray reconstruction, and now all these various technologies that seem to be coming up at CES. Like it's a pretty big lead, and they keep building on it. And at this point, all the other vendors are years behind, I'd have to suggest at this point. So that will if that trajectory continues, then NVIDIA will have a big lead in terms of these fundamental technologies. And also, you'd also assume that the PS6 probably will not have a 4090 level GPU, I would assume, just in terms of raster performance, it's not going to be there. So, that's also going to be a big impediment there. For Rubin is interesting because I have seen those rumors for early 2026. Interestingly, it's a 3nm chip, so it's kind of their first 3nm series of graphics cards there. But the Q1 2026 rumor, I believe, is for enterprise. So that's enterprise with HBM4 memory. So when that hits for consumers, I'd think it could be quite a bit later than that, maybe 6 months, maybe a year, who knows. But certainly with NVIDIA right now, when you look at where they're making money and when you look at where their profit centers are and when you look at why they're a $3 trillion company right now, it's not because they're selling RTX GPUs to PC gamers. It's because of the data center. And that would certainly be where their priorities are. And I would suggest and suspect that if they're launching a 5090 in Q1 2025, they wouldn't be launching a 6090 in Q1 2026. That's a very unusual pacing for consumer graphics at this point.
Yeah, why would they need to? I guess, if there is going to be a Rubin architecture in 2026, that's actually an interesting point of delineation if it's on a much smaller node. First of all, it'll be affordable in that marketplace because they charge a hell of a lot of money for it, which they possibly couldn't do for the consumer. And also basically means that the existing node will get cheaper for the RTX cards for consumers. And ultimately, why would they need to make a more powerful piece of hardware when they've already got the most powerful? It doesn't really make sense. Any thoughts on this one, John?
Not especially, but I mean, I think as we've seen over time with each new console, in the last couple generations. It's becoming harder and harder to top what the PC can do, given that the ceiling has become so much higher in the PC space than it used to be. And consoles are no longer leading the charge in terms of cutting edge features, really, by and large. So, and they have, because of the price point they need to hit, it's just hitting that mark is going to be very, very, very difficult. But of course, as we know, the comparison to PC doesn't really mean everything, right? Like, obviously console developers are able to exploit that hardware in very interesting ways and produce unexpectedly great results, right? So it's not really an issue per se. But as far as this person asking, should they wait for it? I mean, I think just going with a 5090 or 4090 or whatever right now, you're going to be fine for a long time. I think PC gaming in general is actually shifting more towards being more scalable than it's been for a while with the rise of popularity of portable PCs. So I just don't think there's that much of an issue with it. I think any high-end card is going to last for years and years and years and years without any issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately, there's just the whole question of what we should expect from next gen, because clearly it's not going to be PC-like, where it's more about getting the most of the most efficient design out of a set budget. Whereas with PC, it's like, well, how much money do you have? We've got the product for you. It's that simple, really. Let's move on. Question here from Yogi. What led to the poor state of games shipped in the PlayStation 3, Xbox 3 Series, Xbox 360 era? Was it simply developers reaching too far beyond their grasp? It's an interesting question, right, Joel? Because we look back at that particular generation, and it was the case that, well, games were kind of running generally much slower than the games from the PS2 era, right?
Yeah, so I actually do think it is a case of developers overreaching largely. That generation of hardware introduced a lot of very compelling new technical features, but the hardware itself wasn't capable of delivering this at high frame rates, at high resolutions, really, not yet. And too many games, once you go down a certain path, like start implementing, cascaded shadow maps and all these different like pixel shader effects and really stacking that stuff up, like the requirements on the GPU side just become too high. So yeah, I think it's largely a case of developers overreaching with new exciting technology that was perhaps not quite performant enough on that generation of GPUs. I feel like the PS2 generation specifically was very balanced in terms of screen resolution output, the target displays still being STTVs, right? Or even, 480p on Xbox or Dreamcast case. But that number of pixels, they were able to push while utilizing all features of the GPU, basically, at a reasonable frame rate. When you get to the next generation, though, the problem there is largely related to those effects like cascaded shadow maps, pixel shader effects, layering in all these new technologies. There's research and development happening. Ambient occlusion starts to show up. You're looking at all these new methods of rendering out anti-aliasing as well, and it's just problems with like generating the whole image that doesn't really work well at the resolutions that those systems were targeting, which was made worse by the fact that they moved to fixed pixel displays largely. That's what the HD era brought with it, which meant that if you're not targeting exact multiples of those resolutions, you end up with worse image quality. So they had to battle with that as well. And so, but the reason I say it's developers overreaching comes down to the fact that there are examples of games that run exceptionally well on those systems. Like Ridge Racer 7's a go-to for me, right? 1080p, native, 60 FPS, beautiful art design. The game looks awesome and it runs like a dream. But while it does take advantage of some of the new features, it's largely more looking back. They're not doing a lot of the more dynamic, advanced things that a lot of other games at the time were doing. And I think that's basically where the mistake was made. Where if developers had focused more on perhaps slightly less pushing the boundaries of technology, maybe scaling back these desires for real-time lighting and shadow everywhere, sticking more with baked lighting, and just sort of simplifying sort of that and focusing on the art design, the art direction, while achieving higher frame rates, I think we could have seen much better results overall. And it is like, I also think the proliferation of Unreal Engine played a role in this as well, because the base feature set of Unreal Engine 3 was really designed for 30 FPS on those machines.
Yeah.
That's what Epic was kind of targeting. And even then, getting to a stable 30 wasn't trivial. And a lot of developers started using Unreal Engine during that generation,
Yeah.
right? Mm-hmm. So that obviously that plays a role. In addition, I would also venture that generation saw the rise of Western developers in the console space in a big way that hadn't previously been the case. I mean, yes, you had your Rockstar with like GTA. Those never ran well. But if you go back to Xbox, PS2, GameCube, and all that, by and large, I feel like Western developed games largely ran worse. They were the ones that tended to target 30 frames per second more often. Not all the time, but more often. Japanese developed games were more about pushing 60 FPS with, then cutting edge visuals. But the Japanese developers really struggled with PS360 early on, and that we saw sort of a quiet period for that scene, while Western developers were starting to focus more on, well, what if we can bring more PC-like experiences to the consoles now? And those also come with an inherent overhead in addition to everything else that's going on that makes it tough to run them smoothly. So it's like games are getting bigger, they're doing more real-time effects, new cutting-edge techniques all over the place, and they're trying to push this at HD resolutions. It was just too much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think there's much I can really add to that. There's certainly a lot going on there.
Right.
The move to LCD from CRT was certainly challenging. There wasn't really so much of an emphasis on stuff like anti-aliasing in prior generations because, the CRT held, it basically smoothed over a lot of evils, really, didn't it?
Actually, that people used to say, well, Xbox has anti-aliasing, PS2 doesn't and such, but that's not really true. They largely, very few games back then shipped with any form of anti-aliasing. What people saw instead was flicker filtering, which PS2 could also do, but not by default, where Xbox pretty much forced it across the board, which actually kind of blurs the image, but it blends the scan lines together so you don't get that flicker effect, and it reduces any sort of motion jaggies on interlaced content. So that was what anti-aliasing was back in the day, basically.
Absolutely.
But then, on the next generation, you needed to get real AA involved. And that was until the post-processing AA came along. Like, was it MLAA?
Yeah, that was the
Sony one.
Yeah.
And then, obviously, FXA and all that kind of stuff. That became much more performant. But before that, developers were trying to squeeze, like, multi-sampling.
Yeah.
At bet. Like, that was kind of like their option, right? Or even games like Killzone 2 running on, like, the PS3, which is a stunning looking game, they still had to utilize multi-sampling. It was like 2x MSAA or something.
Yeah.
I think the Quincunx, maybe.
Yes, that's right.
Remember Quincunx?
Do you have any input on this one, Oliver?
You guys are the experts on this one because you guys were actually working during some of this period. But I would say that, and games were pushing out such a huge scope. Like if you look at a game like Far Cry 3, that runs pretty poorly. Like 15 FPS often, 20 FPS often on those consoles. But that's also a game concept that like you couldn't really do on a PS2, I don't think, not credibly at least. When you get to like PS4, Xbox One, in a lot of cases, the scope is not that much improved from PlayStation 3 titles or Xbox 360 titles, but the level of stability you're getting there is much better. And perhaps that's just because they have a lot more GPU resources to play with relative to the CPU, kind of famously in that generation, and they can achieve these big wide open vistas with like pretty impeccable image quality, relatively speaking, and all these advanced effects, all this advanced lighting, all this real-time lighting in a way that you couldn't really do on a 360, at least without running into major performance bottlenecks at times. Also, back then, you didn't really tend to have techniques like dynamic res. Like Rage was the first big title with dynamic res, I believe.
I digress. It was the Chronicles of Riddick Escape from Butcher Bay on the original Xbox.
I mean, well, that's of course. I mean, there were earlier ones. That's the one that came to mind at least.
Wipeout on PS3. It was a pretty early example of dynamic.
That was an early example.
So I'm incorrect there, but anyways, there were a much smaller number of titles that used dynamic resolution, and that ended up being a very critical element of load balancing on PS4 consoles and Xbox One consoles in a lot of titles. So that was also not present.
One funny thing you mentioned scope, it reminded me of, so the original Xbox 360 game Test Drive Unlimited, which kind of pioneered this sort of Forza Horizon-like design, right? That got ports to PSP and the PS2 and by Melbourne House. And I was always amazed that they managed to translate that giant open scale racing game, which would become the format going forward for Forza Horizon, as I said, make that work on a PSP and a PS2, especially PSP, running from a freaking UMD. That's nuts. Very, very impressive. The last thing I wanted to mention, though, just reminded me, Capcom's MT framework, right?
Yeah.
This is a perfect example of what happens when you try to go too far. MT framework, the initial release, was super well tuned for Xbox 360. I think the results looked amazing. Games ran at a very consistent 30 FPS, or in some cases 60, like Devil May Cry 4. It was great. Very, very well balanced. But then they did MT Framework 2.0, which focused on deferred lighting and lots of other newer techniques, right? And in the end, the games all ended up running a lot worse. And the visual impact was kind of lessened by the fact that the performance was bad, image quality was less good, and it just didn't work out. So Capcom implemented new forward-looking features into the engine, but it ended up costing a lot in terms of what you actually got out of the end product. And I think that's a perfect illustration of what the kind of mindset that went wrong that generation, where they were more focused on pushing new visual techniques at the expense of performance.
Right.
And it wasn't good.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on. The next question from a question generated by Jensen GPT. The lighting upgrades in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on PC seem to be quite significant and are causing something of a stir online. Some people are stating that those upgrades could have been afforded to the PS5 Pro version of the game in a 30 FPS mode. I guess we won't know the performance hit for enabling the upgraded lighting until the PC version releases. But does this seem plausible? What do you think, Oliver? It seems plausible, but obviously the resolution would reduce, or some other mitigation would be needed to hit the performance budget.
Yeah, I'm actually very curious to see how this shakes out. I'm going to be very interested to see what Alex's coverage looks like in this title when it releases in January, because to me, at least, going through by the screenshots that people have looked at online, it seems to basically be mostly a difference that you see in cutscenes, where you get this improved lighting presentation where maybe the shadows are higher resolution, fine, and the lighting setups are just different in terms of the position of like the key light, the fill light, all these things. They're just different. They're tweaked in kind of a cinematic sense. Like obviously the lighting setups in cutscenes are not like systemic lights that you'd see in games. These are hand placed, carefully arranged, and it just seems like the arrangement might be different in some scenes. So yeah, it's unusual to me. I would presume there's some performance hit, at least to some of those elements there. But when I looked through the trailer initially, a lot of elements during gameplay at least seem pretty similar. Like when you look at the lighting in the environments, the presentation of GI or lack thereof or whatever, it looks pretty similar there. When you look at the shadow draw, the CSMs there, that kind of cascade line, it's at a similar distance, and the resolution of the cascade close to the camera is pretty high, and the cascade close further afield is much lower. So to me, at least, it seems like they are addressing lighting in this game for sure, but it's not addressing lighting in this game in a way that would really follow from, I think, common critiques of this game's lighting, if you get what I'm saying. Maybe it's more in the cutscenes. At least that's from the like 30 seconds of footage that we have. It's so brief here to try to do any kind of analysis on it, but at least that's my judgment thus far, that it mostly applies to the cutscenes, I think.
Okay, yeah, it seems fair enough. I guess we just don't really know what we're going to be seeing until the game actually launches. I'd be curious to know why they would add these changes, or whether they were just sort of possibly planned for PlayStation but not implemented. I don't know. The concept of adding developmental effort on a PC port, it's not very Square Enix like, based on what we saw from Final Fantasy VII Remake. So yeah, I'd be interested to see how that one all plays out. But what I'd like to see is just like the thing that stuck out to me from your coverage, Oliver, was just that the level of detail transitions were really quite rough on console.
Yes.
I'd hope to see that addressed. Is there anything else you'd like to see addressed there, John?
I'd like it to not stutter.
That's
Final Fantasy VII Remake had major issues with that. This is a UE4 game,
yes,
and it's an open world game, and traditionally PC UE4 open world games have not run very well at all in that regard. So can they get this under control? We'll see. I'm also skeptical of the improvements still, because all we have is this like very short cinematic-y trailer, and those types of things. It's more like I'll believe it when I see it kind of thing. I want to see what the final product actually looks like to better understand what the heck's going on. It's really hard to tell like why it looks different from a trailer like this. So
Yeah.
still much to be learned, I think.
Okay, let's move on to the final question. This one from Garton Risa. With games still releasing for last gen, what in your opinion is the best looking last gen game? Or rather, what game gets the most out of the hardware graphics wise? Kind of like what Arkham Knight was for the PS3. Wasn't Arkham Knight on the PS4?
I was going to say Arkham Knight for PS4. And then he's
Arkham Knight for PS3 is actually on Switch.
Oh!
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question.
Brilliant.
I'm going to go to you on this one first, John. I think on balance, Red Dead Redemption 2 would be my pick, but what do you think?
Oh, that's difficult. You're right. Red Dead Redemption 2 is definitely going to be very, very, very high on my list there. But I might also venture... Man, it's maybe not as good. I still think freaking Uncharted 4 looks incredible.
Yeah.
There's just something about the way the presentation plays out in there. And even Red Dead Redemption 2, I think, doesn't compete in terms of cutscene quality.
Yeah.
Again, very different games, but just like the presentation of those cutscenes in Uncharted 4 is unbelievably high quality. Really, really at a high level. And it takes it over The Last of Us Part 2 for me, just because I think the setting is more pleasing and varied, and they're able to run wild with colors and cool designs in a way that you really can't do in The Last of Us. So it's one of Red Dead 2, Uncharted 4, those are top. And then I would also throw in, honestly, Arkham Knight. I think Arkham Knight looks insanely good still today. Like, it's hard to believe that it's running on such old technology. But when you see it running properly, it's just like, wow, this was a stunning achievement. And it's one that obviously Rocksteady themselves was not able to top at all.
Right.
With Suicide Squad, which is nowhere near as impressive looking. Despite doing some pretty cool things technically, it's still Arkham Knight wins on that one.
Oliver?
I'm going to pick one a bit out of left field here. And I'm going to say that Battlefield 1... Well, it's not the most impressive, perhaps. I think it did a lot of things that were really cool, especially really early in that generation, because it had great looking lighting and big battles and a gigantic scope. And then you had all these like Leviathan things, these map changing things like the trains and the big boats and the Zeppelins in particular. Those Zeppelins, when you went on the Zeppelin and you took it down, and there's all this fire and all this smoke, and the skeleton of the Zeppelin is falling down and making impact with the map and breaking structures. That to me was such a cool thing. And then when DICE went to Battlefield 5 and then later Battlefield 2042, those elements, those big, large-scale elements, destructive elements, interactive elements, those were kind of gone and put to the wayside. Instead, you had like fancy weather and things like that, but they weren't quite as compelling there. So I think that game, in terms of what it was pushing while running at 60 FPS and at least a lot of content, especially on PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, I think that was a really compelling title. And it came, pretty early into that generation. But for... like in an absolute sense, I'd have to go with Tilu Part 2, probably, just because of Naughty Dog's incredible artistry there, incredible technology, just taking advantage of PlayStation 4 hardware to produce something that is just incredible cinematic and storytelling experience that really has, no major compromises. I mean, on that hardware, it takes advantage of it perfectly. I think the reliance on light maps worked perfectly for that hardware. And it was just an exceptional experience. But I think Uncharted 4 also has its merit just in terms of having a larger scope, having more action, having more crazy sequences and eye-catching moments. Uncharted 4 also stands out there, even if certain elements of the storytelling technology and the cutscenes, character rendering, crazy like cloth stuff, that's all better in The Last of Us Part 2 Adventure.
Man, there's two more I would throw in the ring, though. Death Stranding and The Order 1886.
Right.
I think those are phenomenal looking games.
Best looking last
Truly,
gen
truly
game.
stunning.
They're up there. I'm not sure they'd be the best looking.
Yeah. I feel like Death Stranding is close though in some ways,
Yeah.
but but that's tech plus art coming together to create something that's so striking and unique looking.
It's fair play.
And maybe if we go to pre PS4 Pro, then the order stacks up there really high, I think.
Cool. Okay, well, that was the final question of the show, therefore the end of the show and the last show of 2024 indeed. So what can I say? Like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed it. Ring the bell for notifications and algorithm boosts and whatnot. DF supporter program. Join us for all of our amazing community features, early access to content, the ability to help shape the show, and get to see the show early each and every week. But that's all from us on this one, and indeed for DF Directs for the whole of 2024. Thanks as ever for watching and supporting Digital Foundry, and happy holidays.